There we go. We have the surface regional terms, and we can divide the body in certain ways. Okay? Not only do we divide the body and kind of think about it by separating it in these kind of arbitrary regions, but the body itself is divided into different areas. Okay? So we have two different body cavities within the body itself. Okay? So those cavities are grouped into a ventral cavity, ventral, or what's another word for ventral? Anterior, and then we also have a posterior or dorsal part. Okay? And it's going to look kind of weird because you might think like one part of it that is not necessarily dorsal, it's just superior, but you'll see what it kind of, okay? So here's the posterior aspect, the posterior dorsal body cavity. That whole thing is encased in bone. What on the back, the posterior side of your body is encased in bone? The spine, okay? And the spine is attached to what? Up here. The spine is attached to the skull. What's inside of those two things? What's inside of the skull? I was thinking, yes, but in general terms, the organ that's inside the skull, the brain. What is the organ that's inside of the spinal or the vertebral column? The spinal cord. Okay? So what you have, that posterior aspect we call the dorsal body cavity, includes the skull, well, the area inside the skull, and the area inside the vertebral column. Okay? And we can break that into two different parts. What I just told you, the cranial cavity, or also called the endocranium, right? That's the inside of the skull where the brain is housed. Okay, that's part of the cranial cavity. And then you have the vertebral canal, because the brain is attached, right? The nerves that exit the brain leave via the spinal cord, and that spinal cord goes right through the vertebral canal. Okay, so your posterior body cavity can be broken into the cranial cavity and then the vertebral canal. Questions on that? The ventral or the body cavity or the anterior body cavity is larger than the posterior. Okay, it's obviously placed where? If it's called the anterior body cavity, where is it? Towards the front, right? Anterior. Okay? It is not completely encased in bone, so it's a little bit different, right? And it's broken into two different areas. The thoracic cavity, thorax, right? It's up to the rib cage and the heart, okay? And the lungs, that area. Everything above the diaphragm. And that's the superior part of it. The inferior part is the abdominopelvic cavity. Everything below the diaphragm. Okay? That includes the abdomen and area of the pelvis. So what's the boundary between the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity? It is the diaphragm. Okay? Nope. Let me see. So I can make sure. Right? They are called serous membranes. All right? In the abdominal pelvic cavity, they're called serous membranes. Those membranes produce a fluid, right, called serous fluid. And the purpose of the fluid is to prevent friction. The lungs move when you breathe. They expand and they contract, yes? And while you're breathing in and out, the heart is contracting, yes?
What is the serous membrane made of?
It's made up of epithelial tissue, okay? So it's it's an epithelial lining that is around the whole organ so that it provides that boundary across from each other, okay? So, not only does the serous membranes line and cover the organs, but it also covers the cavity that it resides in. Okay? Kind of interesting, right? But if you think about it like this, if we have our thoracic cavity, and what's the separation between the thoracic cavity? Your diaphragm, right? Here's a thoracic cavity, and inside the thoracic cavity we have the lungs in blue, okay, and the heart is in red. And no, this is not the best drawing in the world. It is what it is. Okay? So the heart's in red. Not good. Okay. All right? All of these things are moving. And when you move, like when you rub your hands back and forth really fast, what happens? It gets warm. Okay? We don't want that to happen. And not only it gets warm, but then if you continue to do it, it gets painful. Right? If you do it hard enough, it can cause problems and burn, right? And it would hurt the tissue underneath. Well, we don't want that to happen inside the internal organs. So the organs are lined with this serous membrane, and not only are the organs lined, but so is the cavity itself. Okay? So in purple here, I'm going to put this little. Okay, so around here, there's a lining. The serous membrane lines the inside of the whole cavity. Okay, that is one layer of the whole serous membrane. That is what we call the parietal layer. All right, parietal layer of the membrane that always lines the cavity. Okay. It is separate from the membrane that lines the organ. Whoop. Let's do this, make sure that I do that and then that doesn't happen again. Okay? So, parietal, right, lines the cavity. That's one half of the membrane. The other half of the membrane lines each organ. Okay? So, that part is going, so we got to have one for the lungs. I'm going to do it in the same color, but, all right, so we're going to have, and that's going to be a visceral half, right? Visceral serous membrane, and that lines the organ. Okay? So we're going to talk about visceral and parietal in the thoracic cavity, serous membranes, and then we have visceral plural in the abdominal pelvic cavity as well. Okay? The name of the membranes in the thoracic cavity are called pleura. Okay? So we could have visceral pleura, or we could have parietal pleura. Which one, visceral or parietal, would you find lining the lungs? Visceral. Which one, parietal or visceral, would you find lining the cavity? Parietal. Okay? Now I didn't say the heart, right? The heart has its own special area inside the middle of there, right? What we call the mediastinum. The heart has its own cavity within the thoracic cavity. All right, so the heart here actually has what's called the pericardial cavity. Okay? But the heart has serous membranes as well. One lines, right? We have the heart, the serous membranes that line the heart are called the pericardium. Okay? And just like the pleura, they're paired. We have a visceral and we have a parietal. Okay? We have a parietal pericardium that is the whole, makes up the cavity. And then we have a visceral pericardium that lines what? It lines the heart organ. Okay? So visceral and parietal pericardium, right? So we have a visceral here. We have a visceral would be like the dotted lines lining the heart. Okay? So right now we have two serous membranes, the pleura and the pericardium, and we are clear on what visceral and parietal are. Each of those serous membranes has two layers, a visceral and a parietal. Okay? That's in the thoracic cavity. Now, I said we also have the same thing in the parietal cavity. Or excuse me, there's no such thing as a parietal cavity. In the abdominal pelvic, this is what it looks like. Okay, we're going to look at this real quick. On the left side, you have the cranial cavity and the vertebral column, which is the posterior aspect or the posterior body cavity. Right, and on the anterior surface, you have the thoracic cavity in green and the abdominal pelvic cavity. All right, which we can further break into abdomen versus pelvic. Right, but really the abdominal pelvic cavity is, for the most part, lumped together. Okay, we talk about them. We don't really separate those two out. Okay. Now the thoracic cavity on the in the right panel here is divided into further compartments. Okay, so the thoracic cavity, what organs are found in the thoracic cavity? The lungs, and what else? And the heart. Okay, well, what does the heart do? It pumps blood, and how does it pump blood? Through contraction. So it contracts, right? And when it contracts inside the body, we want to make sure that it's moving, so we keep it separate from the other stuff. Okay? So the organs that are found inside these body cavities, whether it's the posterior or the anterior cavities, they are lined by a membrane. Okay? We don't want the stomach bumping into the liver. We don't want the small intestine floating around everywhere and getting kind of twisting on itself. They're separate, right? We don't want the heart beating and causing friction and rubbing up against the lungs. All right, so all of the organs are lined. They're separated, okay, by certain membranes. All right, okay. In the abdominal pelvic cavity, that serous membrane is called peritoneum. It's a serous membrane, so does it have two layers? Yes. Yes, it does. Right? So we have just the same visceral peritoneum and parietal peritoneum. What does the parietal peritoneum line? The cavity. Where would you find the visceral peritoneum inside the abdominal pelvic cavity? It would line the stomach. It would line the pull. Just, yeah, you go. Right? It would line the small intestine. It would line parts of the liver. Okay? So here's what the serous membranes look like. Right? They're arranged like fists in a balloon. Now you take your fist and you put it into you take a water balloon, right? And you a big one, it's moderately full, and you push your fist against it. Okay? The piece of the balloon that's around your fist or around your skin represents your visceral serous membrane. The one that's separated from the fluid on the outside or away from your fist, that is the parietal serous membrane, that layer. What's the fluid in between? It's serous fluid. And what's its function? To what? Reduce friction. Right? It's going to reduce friction, especially with all of those organs moving. Right? So your heart, which is about the size of your fist, is covered in these two serous membranes, and it's in the pericardial cavity, and it has fluid around it. Okay? So there's your pericardium, visceral pericardium, pericardial cavity. All right, we talked about pleural membranes. They're in the thoracic cavity. They line the lungs. Okay? Questions on cavities or membranes? So here's your pleura, written out, parietal and visceral, and the pleural cavity. All of these slides are going to be are available on Blackboard already, right? Good. Make sure that went through. All right, and then so here is parietal versus visceral and what it looks like, okay? And then the pericardium, parietal versus visceral, right? Visceral, way I like to remember it, visceral always refers to an organ, right? If you said so, you had a visceral reaction to something when you watched it on TV, it means your stomach kind of turned, your gut kind of like, oh, you felt sick, right? That's having a visceral reaction. That's what that's why I learned it, was kind of, it refers to your organs rather than something else. Okay, so we have the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, which we separate abdominal pelvic into two different parts. The abdominal cavity is superior, the pelvic cavity is inferior, right? The abdominal cavity contains most of your digestive system. It's kind of wrong because the kidneys are what we call retroperitoneal. This says kidneys, right? But they are retroperitoneal. What that means is that they are outside of the cavity. Okay? Your kidneys don't move around, right? They're kind of in the back here. They're tucked up under the ribs, right? They don't move around, so they don't need to be covered by the serous membranes. Instead, they have this fibrous capsule that protects them and a little bit of layer of fat that keeps them where they need to be. Okay? And so then part of the kidney produces urine, and that urine moves through the ureter to the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder is covered by the peritoneum in the abdominal and in the pelvic cavity, and the ureters have to go from outside the peritoneum to inside the peritoneum. That's the connection between the two. Okay? So that just kind of give you an idea. They are retroperitoneal. They are outside. So this, I actually should cross that out. They don't belong there. Okay? Questions on abdominal cavity, right? And we have visceral and parietal peritoneum. This is what it looks like, okay? So you have the parietal peritoneum, which kind of encircles everything, and then you have the visceral portion that kind of wraps around all of the different organs, okay? And part of this, it also will take in some fat, and the blood vessels run through that. You'll see this when we talk about the digestive system next semester, especially in the cadavers in lab. You'll be able to see what that looks like, and the blood vessels run out through it and kind of holds everything in. All right, so I call it the 3 P's for serous membranes: pleura, pericardium, and peritoneum. Right? And we know that each of those has a visceral and a parietal layer. Questions on body cavities? Abdominal pelvic regions and quadrants. Okay? The abdominal pelvic area has a lot of organs, and a way for us to kind of reference where things are on the surface. We use the quadrants, or this tic-tac-toe board, as I like to call it, the different regions, to determine where things are. Okay? So on the right side of the individual in the tic-tac-toe board over here, you have the hypochondriac region. That's right. And then on the other side, we have the left hypochondriac region. So this is the upper corners. Okay? On the right side. So on both sides, it goes superior hypochondriac, lumbar, iliac. Right? Right? Lumbar and iliac refer to the area of the backbone, right? And then the ilium is the hip bone that you're going to be you'll learn about, all right? So on right and left sides, we have those. And then down the middle, the epigastric, it means above the stomach. Most of the stomach's there. The umbilical region is right around your belly button, right? That's the umbilical. And then below this, below the umbilical, is the hypogastric region. That's where most of the bladder is. Okay? The quadrants are much easier. Okay? Right upper, left upper, and everything is based off of the cross section just above your belly button. Okay? Imagine, here's your umbilical region. If I make this straight line across, that's right where the belly button is. So at the belly button being your midpoint, your origin, right, your cross section, right upper, left upper. Anything above or left to the belly button, right lower, left lower. Okay? Why do we use this? Clinicians use it to say, to ask patients, where do you feel pain? Here, my stomach hurts. Okay, right here. Okay, that's fine. Your stomach is in the left upper quadrant. That's logical, right? If someone said in their left lower quadrant and said, down here, I think I have an appendicitis. Well, your left lower quadrant isn't where the appendix is. It's in your right up lower quadrant. Okay? So immediately you can rule out the fact that it's not an appendicitis. You probably just have a pulled muscle. Okay? Or could be something else. All right? So we can that's what clinicians use it for. You'll see it on, if any of you ever do any medical scribing, you might see it written as RUQ, pain, whatever. All right? I need to go over those again, written out. Questions on body cavities and regions? Okay? So we have this terminology. We understand the relationship between anatomy and physiology. We kind of have a baseline reference of what we're looking at in terms of the human organism. Now we understand that it's made up of, it's organized, it has organ systems, and those organ systems work together to maintain homeostasis. Okay? Homeostasis is the relative constancy, all right, consistent internal environment, even in response to changing external environments, right? You go to have a cryotherapy session, you got your socks and your mittens on, and liquid nitrogen is pumped around you, and it goes down to minus 200 degrees Fahrenheit for about 3 minutes. And what happens to your body temperature? It goes down. How much? Do you freeze? No. But everything around you is really cold.
Your body's working to make you warmer.
Your body's working to make you warmer. Okay? The basics of how many of you have heard of cryotherapy before? Okay? Good. The science behind it is that it's going to take away pain, reduce inflammation by it being cold, but then it's also going to kick up your metabolism of your muscles so that they heal faster. That's the basic science behind it.
Isn't it just like if you have swelling and you ice it, is that
Yes,
the same thing?
it's similar, but so if you have swelling and you ice it, reduce inflammation and remove pain. But
Reduce
real
inflammation by increasing
Well,
Blood flow, I guess? I don't
it
know.
would reduce blood flow because of the, like,
Oh, right.
and we'll talk about that when we go over inflammation. But the cryotherapy is real quick, and it really makes your muscles like start metabolism to repair. It's gonna do less for inflammation than just muscle repair. Okay, but we're gonna maintain homeostasis. Okay, maintain that normal body temperature. We're gonna talk about normal amounts of sugar in the blood. Everything that you do is kind of to keep you, your body's always working to keep you at an even set point. Okay? And so you have three basic components of a homeostatic system. So I gave you a couple of examples. I gave you body temperature, blood glucose levels. You could talk about hormone levels in your body. You name it. A lot of these are homeostatic mechanisms meant to keep you at a normal state. Okay, so if something goes up, you recognize that, right? The temperature around you is getting warmer. All right, you recognize that, and your body works to cool you down, right? So today, there's three basic components. You have a receptor, okay? Something that's going to recognize the stimuli around you. You're going to recognize that your body temperature is going up, okay? Or it's warmer in here, okay? That senses the stimulus, okay? Change in temperature is sensed by the skin. That sends a signal to the brain. The brain is your control center, okay? Or it may not be the brain, it could be the endocrine system or whatever else. But it's something, in most cases, in 99% of the cases, it's a nervous system, okay? But the nervous system and the endocrine system, they work together to maintain that constancy, okay? So they recognize the stimulus and they can interpret it. When they interpret it, they register an appropriate response, okay? So the response goes out. So stimulus is my body temperature goes up, right? Or it's warm in here. I feel the stimulus. I recognize it by nervous system. What's the response? Body temperature goes up. What happens? You start to sweat. Okay? In most cases, and what does sweat do? It works to cool you down. Okay? In most cases, this ends up by a negative feedback. So that response targets an effector. All right? What's the effect of an elevated body temperature? What do? You sweat, right? Well, where does the sweat come from? Sweat glands. Okay? So in this case, the sweat gland is your effector. It is going to release sweat on the skin to help cool you down. The effector is a structure that brings about the change, right, to alter the stimulus. Most of these mechanisms are negative feedback, where the response or the effector counteracts, works against the stimulus. All right, so here, changes in variable, right? Temperature, stretch in a muscle are examples. Blood flow, okay? Your heart starts beating faster, right? Blood pressure, salt concentrations in the blood, okay? Blood volume, those are all homeostatic mechanisms that your body regulates. Calcium in the blood, phosphorus in the blood, they're all regulated, okay? So we have a stimulus too low or too high. The receptor recognizes the stimulus, responds. The receptor could be stimulus in the stretch of proprioceptors, could be skin receptors, understanding temperature, you name it. Sends that signal to the control center. It's interpreted, and then the response is produced, targets the effector, and then the effector brings about the change, and you bring back homeostasis back to normal. Okay? Those are the mechanisms. Really, you could say three components: receptor, control center, effector, but stimulus and response are also important aspects that you should know. Okay? This is an example of negative feedback. Most of this, okay, is most of these homeostatic mechanisms work by negative feedback, where the stimulus, right, is counteracted by the response. The homeostatic mechanism works to counteract the stimulus. Body temperature goes up, we want to bring it back down. Body temperature goes down, what happens? You go outside in the cold for a while, what do you start doing? You start shivering, okay? What's the stimulus? Give me the cold. Give me an example of the receptor. Where would those receptors be found? In your skin, okay? The control center is the nervous system. What's the response? Shivering. What is the effector? What's the target of the control center response? What's the target? Your muscles are shivering, right? So your muscles, when you're shivering, the muscles are the effector. They are doing the action that is working to counteract the stimulus. The muscles contract, right, when you're shivering. They're contracting uncontrollably. Short contractions. Well, muscle contraction, what does it produce? Heat. And it works to elevate your body temperature. Okay? Contrast to that, positive feedback. So if negative feedback works against the stimulus, what does positive feedback do? Works with. And it actually makes the stimulus more intense. Okay? And there's only 3 examples of positive feedback in the human. Okay? So we have a stimulus. Receptor recognizes that stimulus. Control center understands it, interprets it, and now it sends a response that's going to cause the stimulus to be more. The best example is labor, childbirth. Okay? During the 9 months, the fetus gets really big, okay? Gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and as it gets bigger, it pushes on the cervix, okay, in the female. That pressure on the cervix is the stimulus, okay? That's the stimulus, and the receptor is in the pressure receptors in the cervix. That sends a signal to the brain, okay, to the endocrine system that, hey, it's time for childbirth. And what hormone is produced? Oxytocin. Okay? Oxytocin is produced in response to that. And what oxytocin is released, what's the effector? It dilates the cervix, and what starts to happen? What does the uterus do? It contracts. When the uterus contracts, what happens to the space the fetus was living in? It gets smaller. And what does it do? It pushes more pressure on the cervix. More pressure, it means a higher stimulus. Stimulus goes back to the brain, and this keeps going. You've seen it all on Grey's Anatomy and ER and all the other shows, The Resident. Childbirth, right? What happens to contractions over time? They get more frequent and they get more intense. That is positive feedback, right? It's going to augment and positively push the stimulus and make it bigger. Well, what's the problem with that? Those contractions get really quick and they get really intense. They get really quick and really intense. What would happen if there was no end point to that? It just keep going, right? That's the reason why childbirth has a defined endpoint. Okay? The other ones, blood clotting and breastfeeding, have a defined endpoint. It's not up and down and go back towards the set point. It's there's done. At some point in time, those contractions are going to push the fetus out, and there will be no more pressure on the cervix. Okay? At some point in time, blood clotting will cause, and there will be no more bleeding. All right? These only occur where there is a defined endpoint. All right? Until that climactic event occurs. Right? the fetus is passed through the cervix and out the birth canal. Done. Okay? So it's not up and down. Positive feedback goes to a certain point.
Would blood clotting still be a positive feedback if you had a clotting disorder? Like if you just, like hemophilia or something
No,
like that?
because you're taking that point out, right? So blood clotting works and you get this cascade of events. Eventually, one cell fragment binds to a broken thing, and then the next ones do. And then it gets to a point where it starts going. But if you cut out that endpoint, it'll just keep going.
So if you cut out the binding?
Yeah, if you cut out the
Which is the
binding,
endpoint.
exactly, it just keeps bleeding. Okay, here's the positive feedback of breastfeeding, same thing. All right, homeostasis, health and disease. Homeostasis is your relative constancy. Your body is normally in homeostasis. That's what all your systems are working for, to maintain you there, right? You go exercise, you're gonna work out the heart, you're going to work your respiratory system, and you're going to start to kind of try to maintain your normal blood pressure, the normal amounts of glucose in your body, et cetera, okay? It's gonna come back to normal. What happens when homeostasis is out of whack? What happens when you get a fever? What's happening? You're getting sick. And a fever is an abnormal body temperature, right? Where you would normally sweat, but guess what? Your set point is off. Something's off, right? And usually it's indicative of some type of disease, okay? So if the system fails, if your homeostatic imbalance or disease results, right? Anyone have family members that have take medication for high blood pressure? I do. It is a homeostatic imbalance. Normal blood pressure is 120/80. If it's high, well, my set point, I have whatever, I don't work out enough, I don't know, whatever. Could be genetics, who cares? Could be stress, all you guys. Kidding, I won't blame you. It's Kyle's fault. It causes blood pressure to be a little elevated. It makes my heart work harder, right? It makes my blood vessels be more dilated because it's not in the right set point, okay? It's not in the optimal point, okay? So here are some normal ranges, kind of for clinical practice. Body temperature, 98.6. Your blood glucose should be about 80 to 110. Blood pressure, 90 to 120 over 60 to 80. I'm about 130 over 90, so I'm getting there. All right, and it's determined by sampling a bunch of individuals and finding that statistical normalcy. Okay, here's other examples of homeostatic disease. I said high blood pressure, diabetes. Okay, diabetes caused by differences in being unable to regulate blood glucose, hypoglycemia. Right? We want to keep it in that 80 to 110 range, but if I walk outside, I step outside, I drink a bottle of Mountain Dew or a double shot of Starbucks energy drink, right? What happens? That's a bunch of sugar I just consumed. What happens to my blood glucose levels once I absorb that sugar? It goes up. My body's going to release insulin, right, to make it go from the blood to cells so that it stays in that range. But if I can't produce insulin, what happens to my blood sugar? If I can't produce insulin, it stays up, right? I can't regulate it because the insulin's not working. That is basically what a diabetic is. Somehow the insulin's not working. Okay? And then we have plenty of pharmacological agents that can help with this. Blood pressure medication, okay? So I take blood pressure medication which will help, which causes basically makes my kidneys work more to help reduce blood volume. So I have to go to the bathroom a lot more, and it brings my blood pressure down to normal, okay? Diabetes, what do diabetics do? They regulate their blood sugar, they may have to take insulin, right? That's type 1 diabetics. Type 2 diabetics have to regulate their diet really well. Okay? And then patients with depression take serotonin, SSRI drugs, kind of work to take serotonin and keep those levels at a normal rate so that they don't feel depressed. Okay? Questions? I think that's it. Questions on homeostatic mechanisms? No? Awesome sauce. Questions on body cavities, membranes? No? Good? Clear as mud. Okay, good. All right, so over the weekend, go over those regional terms, right? Make sure you know the three components of a homeostatic mechanism. Also, think about what the stimulus and the response fit into that. Okay, really those 5 different parts of that. Okay, have a good weekend. I will see you on Tuesday.